शुक्लांबरधरं विष्णुं शशिवर्णं चतुर्भुजं प्रसन्नवदनं ध्यायेत् सर्वविघ्नोपशान्तये अज्ञानतिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मीलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। गुरुर्ब्रह्मा गुरुर्विष्णुर्गुरुर्देवो महेश्वरः गुरुः साक्षात् परं ब्रह्म तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। Namaste. Today I am with Sri Raghav Krishna ji. So Raghav Krishna ji is an associate dean in Rashtam School of Public Leadership. So I've been to Rashtam recently for a Anvikshiki course. I really enjoyed that a lot. And today we are here to have a conversation on the occasion, keeping this occasion as a nimittam, what we call it as in Shastram, the occasion of Naraka Chaturdashi and Deepavali. And we want to explore something related to that, and at the same time other facets of how the dismantling forces are working, anti-Sanatana Dharma dismantling forces are working, and how people should understand, people should know, and how they can at least realize that what's happening around them is very targeted, surgical, constructive efforts that the others are putting over there, and what we can do and what we should do. So I hope this conversation will bring up, and this is not just a conversation from the Shastra perspective, we can call it as a Vada, as Tattva Bubhutsoho Kathavadaha, the definition calls itself. So we are here to know the Tattva or the truth about what's really happening out there. So I welcome Raghav Krishna ji, and actually I thank you a lot, sir, for after my invitation, accepting my invitation, and spending some time before festival, because everyone are here to celebrate our festivals. But at the same time, this conversation has an importance to that also. So this is also part of our festival. I suppose this to be like that, and I am thankful for that. You have come in, for my request. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's not just a pleasure to be speaking to you, having been your student in the Nyaya Darshana course that we did. But it is also a matter of both responsibility and gratitude. Responsibility because, as you said, there is a concerted, strategic, and diabolical attempt to malign Hindu festivals, and we need to really understand not just the factors that are driving it, which we'll delve into in this conversation, but also how do we understand our own culture? How do we understand and access our own knowledge traditions? How do we situate meaning in the festivals, in the rituals that our culture has given us? And we cannot do this without actually harking back to tradition, harking back to our own scriptures and sources. And in a lot of ways, this has become inaccessible simply because our current education does not provide us the means to understand these in our own terms. And in that context, the work that you have been doing, and particularly taking up a contemporary issue like media and pop culture portrayal of Hindu festivals, and correcting the distortions that have been introduced maliciously by taking us back to the original meaning of the festivals. What is the meaning of that ritual? What is the benefit of that ritual? What is the prayojana? Who is the yajaman? So taking us back to the Shastric perspective, this is not just about one festival or a season, but this is, I think, fundamentally worldview altering. Once we start thinking in these terms, once we internalize this vocabulary, what I've found in my own limited exploration is that it alters the fundamental way you look at things. And meaning making then does not become an alternate pursuit. There is actually today a great tendency to somehow live your life in one dimension and then go seek meaning and explore in some other dimension. What our culture has given us and in the rich tradition of festivals and rituals and community tools and interfaces is that these things are not separate. Living itself is meaning making. And unless we have access to the knowledge that you provide us, through Shastric references, to the correct interpretations, we will forever be caught in this dichotomy. So thank you for this. I consider this a great responsibility and a privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you about this. And once again, very, very happy to be here to discuss this.
Yeah.
I've also been following the other conversations you've done on the same subject. I followed the Telugu one, tried to understand from you the import of the one that you've done in Sanskrit. I saw the one with Infinity Foundation that came out, I think, a couple of days ago. I saw it yesterday. All of those touch on different dimensions. But like you said, one additional dimension that we can perhaps bring out in this conversation is to understand and study this, not just from the essence of the festival itself, which you've already explained to us, and which we'll probably also have a little bit of a conversation on, but also about explaining to our viewers what are the systemic forces and what are the thought modes and worldviews that drive this. Right? So we will combine the perspective that you already shared with some of the perspectives that we might add through this conversation.
Yeah. For the sake of information, I would like to share that till now there have been 4 videos upon the origin and significance of Naraka Chaturdashi and Deepavali prior to this. So the first one was in Sanskrit. I had a conversation in Sanskrit with Shri Prem Kumar Ralabandi, so in Sanskritam, and that after that I had a conversation with one of my friend Rajashekharuni Vijay Sharma in Telugu. So there where we even dwell up into the Jyotisha perspective, because each and everything is related to Tithi Nirnaya. So the time that in the particular time which we have, what we have to do, and the details into them. And then the third one was a conversation with 3 other non-resident Indians who are stationed in Australia. So there are different people. We had Mitra Desai ji, who recently wrote a book called Sheetala on vaccination, upon that vaccination being an Ayurvedic practice first. So the vaccination concept of vaccination also has something to do with Bharat. And that was a wonderful conversation. And then we had Infinity Foundation's Shri Vijaya Ranganathanji, where we just confined to the ritual part of it. So we had 4 different videos. Each and every video was different and unique to its own, based upon their language or even the content wise also. The 4 videos were different, but the main focus was on the origin and significance of the festivals. But now in this conversation, I just wanted to focus upon the introductory part in those videos. So much about what's happening out there. So I, as a commoner, from the norm, understanding this subject as to how distortions happen. So in the initial stage, in the childhood or in adolescence, it was not, we were not able to make it out. I was not personally trying to make it out what's happening out there. And even our educational system is such that in India especially, everything and anything, if it is spoken about our Sanatana Dharma, we just sit mum. And if anything is done the same with the others, the people come outraged and they show sympathy and etc. So this was out there, and I was not able to make it out till I actually started studying Shastram and doing my Shastra Adhyayana. Even after completing some years of Shastra Adhyayana, I was not able to do it because we don't have that kind of an orientation in our Abhyasa, in our Adhyayana. So, but as naturally, me and my brother, we were interested even in the contemporary issues. We used to study a lot the other content, other content apart from Shastra. So these all things, they used to, we used to have these questions: why is this happening? What's that? And but that too in a very self-studied manner. So there is actually the attack which is happening. It is in a structural manner. It is well planned. They have theories for it, I suppose, and they have a way to do it. And we here at the end, we are just sitting here and seeing a mockery, where stating it has nothing to do with crackers, Holi has nothing to do with colors, everything has nothing to do with Sanatana Dharma, everything is disassociated, even yoga has nothing to do with Sanatana Dharma. And people, the stalwarts, so-called stalwarts, who are at least seen as representative of yoga, they all are made to come on a board and say that it has nothing to do with Hinduism. And that even Hinduism means Sanatana Dharma for me. So wherever the word Hindu comes, I relate it with Sanatana Dharma. So that actually it irks a lot, because even now, yesterday itself also, there was one very popular figure who stated that Diwali is not a religious festival. he started his conversation, talking about Diwali, and his opening statement was Diwali is not a religious thing. I don't know what religion was. The definition of religion was there in his mind, but everywhere, everything is being effortfully. They're structurally putting it in such a way that it has nothing to do with Sanatana Dharma. So they want to secularize everything. In that name of secularizing things, they want to disassociate everything with Sanatana Dharma. And at the end, after maybe 5 to 10 years, we will maybe forget what it's all about. And maybe it's just a day for holiday for us. It will become to that point maybe. So that is really worrying, as what kind of a knowledge that I'll be passing on to my children and my next generation was the main concern for me till now. Because till now I was a youth, till 5 to 6 years back, I was just like the kind of a youth kind of a thing. And afterwards, when you have kids, you start having these questions, that what is it that I'm going to give my child? Is he going to be lured away by all this narration, or should we have something to stand upon? I should able to at least give him some logical explanation, because Shastra is full of logic. The moment I utter the word Punya and Papa, Naraka and Swarga, people start mocking. So that is the kind of brainwashing that has happened. Even yesterday itself, Infinity Foundation's video came out, and the comments, if you see, so these are all old practices. What if I don't do the Abhyangana Snana, then I'll go to Naraka? Then what kind of a ritual is this? That means I didn't do these many days, so am I going to Naraka? So this is all like taking for granted your stereotype. You say that you are liberal, but you are the most conservative person. You don't want to know what is Naraka for the sake, the concept of Naraka, the concept of Swarga. You want to say that Naraka and Swarga are the Indian versions, Sanatana versions of hell and heaven and Jannat and Jahannam. No way. This is something different, and this is something different, right? And even Papam and Punyam has nothing to do with sin and the counterpart of it. So in this way, I don't get actually raged about those comments, but I feel pity about them, that they're nowhere in a state to at least agree, at least to listen what we are trying to say. So every time if this word Swarga, Naraka, Papa and Punya comes in, the youth are like, this guy is there, he's coming from the Stone Age, and whatever he says is nonsense. So this kind of a stereotypic thing has happened because of these distortions that they have been making it from structurally. They have been doing it from past maybe not more than 50 years, or I don't know, actively. Yeah, maybe while the Britishers are here, they started it in a very long, a very structural manner. Maybe they were fruitful till now in that perspective, if we see. So as a commoner, as a layman in this issue, so I just wanted to know what's this all about and how this really happens from you. Because in the conversations whatever we had, I really get what you call inspired and motivated to do this kind of a work while talking to you, because I have some feelings, and you're putting my intentions in the right words. To be say, you are expressing them in the right manner. I had the feeling, I had these ideas, but I was not able to communicate or put them in the right word, because I was not trained in that. As the same thing happens for you, maybe you may have some ideas, maybe you are not able to put it in the Shastric way, which I am able to do. The same thing happens for me also. I may have some feelings and opinions which I am not able to communicate in the right way. So I thought that I should focus this conversation in that way.
Wonderful. The experience that you've narrated, Srinivas Garu, is actually typical. All of us are commoners. And that takes us back to the point that you also alluded to. It's not in our worldview to try and analyze things for deconstruction. Because the approach of the tradition in the Sanatana Dharma has always been constructive. It has always been integral. And diversity is, again, effortless for us, simply because the ontological position is very, very clear in the tradition itself. And that is why you don't look at this as a separate project. And when we encounter cultures or when we encounter aggression, which seeks to, in the name of understanding us sometimes, in the name of analyzing us, deconstruct and reduce us to the parts and disallow us to be the whole. This is something that we suffer a tremendous amount of dissonance with, because it's not the way we think. And in that context, all of us are commoners who are trying to make sense of why this is so. Some of us have approached it from an institutional perspective in academia and particular studies. Some of us are trying to do this in media. Some of us are trying to do this in pop culture. Some of us are trying to do this in art. But I think unless all of us look up to the traditional sources and the real import of the knowledge that has been handed down to us, we'll actually only be dealing in parts. And that is why, like I said, this conversation is a way to stitch all of these perspectives together and provide, in a capsule, a way, a drishti to look at these things. So I think we're all sort of travelers in that journey, and we need you to lead us. And in fact, Rashtraam itself as an institution was born out of this vision that we should be the interlocutors. There is a knowledge system that has been handed down to us. In our opinion, and with all humility, but also with all clarity, we think that it is the richest knowledge system available to anybody in the world. Not just because it has the greatest amount of range, depth, and rigor, but it also has the ability to provide solutions to the most compelling global problems we have today. If you look at the problems today, whether it is ecological, whether it is to do with loneliness, whether it is to do with immigration, xenophobia, poverty, all of that fundamentally go back to a philosophical void, a void in the truth itself. Because the story that we've been given as a global civilization, let's say in the last 500 years, accelerated by technology in the last 100, 200 years, has now reached the end of its explanatory power. And I'll quickly quote a framework that I find very useful in trying to explain this. It's by a person called Danny Roddick, and he's a political scientist and economist and commentator. And he uses this framework called the inescapable trilemma of global civilization. And he gives us three fundamental forces. First one is the globalization. We are having this conversation today because there is a macro phenomenon of interaction and, in some cases, conflict and clash of cultures, and cultures analyzing each other and therefore trying to interpret a new experience in their own terms, and sometimes with the arrogance of imputing their supremacy over others. That is one phenomenon. The other phenomenon is democracy. All of us have, by and large, settled into a political system now. And we've come to accept this as potentially the most stable situation. But this also means that you are bound and you are sort of obligated to respect the sentiments and opinions of your domestic constituency. So on one hand, you have globalization, which is a universalization force. On the other hand, you have democracy, which is a domestic, the locus of control is in your region. And on the third vector, he gives us the idea of nation state. Nation state as a result of the political ferment that has happened in Europe, which has then sort of solidified into a concrete structure for the entire world. The world politically is today understood as nation states, right? Nation being a feeling of togetherness, a common story, common history, an emotional sort of bonding, a brotherhood. State being the hard entity which has institutions, which also has the monopoly of violence, as Weber put it. So these three paradigms come together and they are mutually incompatible. That is why he calls it the inescapable trilemma. On one hand, you have a globalization force which seeks to universalize. For example, the main sort of obstruction or hindrance for globalization would be different customs and different contexts all over the world, because it raises what we call transaction costs. For example, if a multinational company today in America wants to export its product, and that is what modern capitalism is about. It's about capturing markets and capturing value, which means it also has to constantly seek out newer territories and newer demographics, and in them create a taste for their products. Right? So to do this, it has to develop certain attitudes. And to do that, it has to then control certain means of instruction, whether it is education or media or pop culture. So there is a fundamental globalization force with a lot of capital behind it, which seeks to universalize tastes and preferences. Because, like I said, if you have a different taste for today, if you do not understand the seeking, let's say, for a Coke or for a McDonald's burger, to sort of advertise to you, to try and appease and convert you into a customer, it has to spend extra money, right? For example, let's say then that you have at an aggregate level a policy that supports what you consume locally. It has to then seek to influence that policy to try and make an entry into the local market. So any kind of local context is a barrier for globalization. Okay? And democratic politics obviously has to pay respect to the local context because your voters are in local, right? And your locus of power is local. Right? So there is a tension there. And on the other hand, you have nation state, which is a hard sort of concept. So between the nation state, globalization, and democratic politics, you see a lot of tension and a lot of institutions, structures, systematic mediations that you notice now are also understandable when you start looking at this macro picture. Right? One is, I think there are two ways to frame this. There is the ideological vector, which is very, very, it is animated by a vision of the world that it has given itself. Right? Marxism is a worldview that it has given itself, and it looks at every culture through the lens of oppressor and oppressed. So it can find in any culture and any context somebody who has power, who is oppressing somebody who does not have the power. And on the other vector is the capital class, which seeks to create markets and business. And unfortunately, in the context of our nation, and particularly for Hindus, both these forces are against us. Both the ideological forces, which are seeking to reshape the world in their worldview, because in Hinduism, they locate certain things that they find oppressive, and then they interpret that to suit their convenience. But this is also by itself, it wouldn't have been as pervasive, but it has become the reason why we are having this phenomenon of every ad maker trying to project is that has actually become a consort of the capital class. So these two forces, although they are opposed to each other, the capital class and the, let's say, the cultural Marxist or the Marxism lens, theologically and in terms of actual ideology, they are separate. But when it comes to creating new markets, when it comes to converting new areas, they have to support each other. So you have a strange phenomenon. Yeah.
So I just want to add one thing. Is it like, even though they both are opposite to each other, maybe one is what you call flourishing in the academia, and another is flourishing in the what you call market out there. Can we call it as like
it
that?
Is they are actually, we can map out the specific spaces where this operates, but the spaces themselves are also fluid, Srinivas Garu. They feed into each other. So what gets conceived and sort of formalized as a structure in academia is what informs culture. And that culture is then propagated through media, through ad agencies, through films. So there at the fount is a concept or an ideological formulation that happens in academia and thought spaces. Then you can think of those means as the distribution mechanisms. It could be, it solidifies as a curriculum, and then it goes into all kinds of distributed channels, right from your news to your ad copies, to movies, to sort of cultural exchange that happens, or more pervasively today, the sort of content that gets distributed on OTTs. Right? All of these have an ideological fount, and they feed into each other. But at a higher level, you have these two forces. One is the ideological force, the other one is the capital force. Although they make each other's, in fact, they make their living by opposing each other. So the Marxists are constantly opposing the capitalists, and capitalists are constantly opposing the Marxists. But it's a strange alchemy. They have to come together. The capitalists now have to fund the Marxists to create a new circus, and the circus then gets monetized and productized, and then gets exported. So what we're seeing is actually a result of these two very powerful global forces. And the sort of owners of this are very powerful transnational actors. The large-scale NGOs, the billionaire sort of techno-capitalist class, which then runs charities. These are not any nation's allies. They have their own agenda. And this also gets co-opted by the nations themselves. For example, if you look at the idea of US aid, a lot of this funding comes from the national sovereign aid that United States runs. And that is compellingly and totally ideological. It is not charity. It comes with a huge cost, and then it gets distributed through the structure that we have of NGOs, civil society organizations, academia. In a very mundane way, this is about careers for people, right? But at an aggregate level, this is the death of a civilization. So what you're seeing is systematic removal of agency of Hindus to represent themselves. And that is why it is critical that we bring in the traditional perspective to redefine and reframe this.
Okay. Are these two forces working hand in hand only in India? I mean, how does this framework is different from India compared to US or other countries?
So this is not different. The thing is, I think it's like Bhasmasura to a certain degree. What's happening in US today, and what you've seen, particularly in the last 2 years, they were supposed to have created the perfect recipe for humankind, which is what Fukuyama said is end of history, which meant that he felt that we have no need for history making anymore because we've arrived at the pinnacle. Right? Democracy and free markets and agency and liberty and reason, these will take us to heaven. Right? But where is US today? And not just US as a representation of the Western civilization at large. We're seeing a tremendous amount of strife. And for the first time, perhaps in their own experience, such a materially rich civilization culture is experiencing envy and jealousy and anger. And that is a new emotion for US. You could perhaps always accuse them of being supremacist, but anger, envy, and jealousy is new to them. So there is a tremendous amount of churn that's happening. So in a perverted way for them, what they've created is working against them. But the impact of that is greater on countries like India. India is a big market. India is 1 billion plus people, and whatever happens in India has a global ring to it and global impact to it. So therefore, it is very critical to mold the tastes and preferences of the Indian consumers. If you are a capitalist in US today, who is not, capitalism is also about enterprise, risk-taking, creative ability. All of those are great things about capitalism. But the kind of version that we have today, which seeks to appropriate value by creating cultural fissures, that is what has sort of morphed into this cultural war that we see today. So yes, the impact is there on those countries as well. But in continents like Africa and in nations like India, it's far more deeper. And if you think about it, it's actually very, very unfortunate. We were the colonized. Right? We were the ones who went through 1,000 years of colonization. And somehow we are actually denied the agency to tell our own story. If you actually, and media studies, Professor Vamsi Juluruji and others have pointed this out. If you go and type Hindu phobia, you will get very few search results because it is not institutionalized. Some of the work is happening recently. But if you type Islamophobia, if you type any other religion, it is widely recognized across the entire spectrum from media to academia. Right? So while we were the oppressed, we were the ones who were conquered and brutalized, we are today denied the agency to tell our own story by actually restricting access to these certain academic disciplines and the portals from where truth is supposed to be dictated. Right? So this is when you refer to the systematic part, there are these dominant ideologies. The ideologies have vehicles. They have very, very powerful capital infusion into that. And then you have, because you have a nation which is also not clear about its own identity today, and also simply because people have to live and earn their careers in a demography like ours, which is young, you have a combination of all of these factors, which is resulting in the sort of cultural trends that you see.
Okay. So coming to the current, coming to this Naraka Chaturdashi and all. So what is your actually understanding, the concept, as Naraka Chaturdashi. It has been discussed widely in my other videos. What is it all about to do? I'll not go into that, but I just wanted to touch upon this issue, cover this issue, that much of the Dharma Shastras or Shastras, our total Sanatana literature, has a lot to do with the Papam, Punyam, Narakam, Swargam. So this is a very crux of it. If you're not able to understand these four elements, everything is, everything falls apart, and that is where lot of unnecessary interpretation is being done and needed. If one can understand those parts, actually there is no need to think and say that, this is scientific, this is modern scientific thing, and this has been proved there, this is proved that. No, why you should every time say that? Why every time I should have this problem saying that this is scientific? Why should I prove that this is scientific? It may have a scientific. For me, it is scientific is just a small part of it. Being that particular practice having a scientific way. I mean, we take a herb called Apamarga on Naraka Chaturdashi with a small lump of mud, which is taken by a plow. It is very detailed, thing is there. Even the Apamarga Patra should have a stem to it, have a thorn to it, to have a leaf to it. So this is what the Dharma Shastra says about it. And he says that Hara Papam Apamarga, please diminish my papam. This is what is there. In order to say that this is meaningful, why should I say what could be the result of getting a lump of mud by hala? What could be the, hala being made of so and so, wood? And what is the scientific name of this Apamarga Patra? What are the benefits of it, and what it has to do with on this particular day? Each and everything. Why should everything be so-called scientific? Here I use the word science in the sake of modern science, because even Shastra is also science. But we are in such a state that I cannot say everything Shastra is scientific. So that's why whenever we use this science, people connect to the modern science. And why is this? It is this compelling thing that is coming in between and saying that, to prove that, you see, our rituals are scientific, so we have to do it. Why should we do that? Because we are not able to understand the concepts of Papam, Punyam, Swargam, and Narakam. So how would you actually see? I understood Papam, Punyam, Swargam, and Narakam in my way through Shastras, and I think those are meaningful or not. It depends upon me. Why should I agree Punarjanma or rebirth? Is because it is very logical for me after studying these many years, not just as, as a Sanatani, thing, but I think that this is the most logical way to keep ourselves in, peace, and get on and enjoy the process of life, rather than sticking on to things which are very much confusing. I get a very clear vision about what life is all about, and the Purushartha system that enables me to just focus upon what really that I should be. I should be dharmic in a way, whether if it is related to my pursuit regarding my artha thing, or kama, or fulfilling my desires, or rather, or the way I earn and the way I live my life. Everything should be dharmic. So dharmika artha and dharmika kama. Why should I lead this kind of a life? Because this will essentially lead to moksha. So by and large, if I see from a Shastric perspective, I feel that Shastra is very precise and it is very logical, and everywhere it has a very clear view. So that is why even in my 30s, I'm having a very stable mind, and I'm not bothered about what others think about my religion, my practices, because I have my own understanding, and this is keeping me in peace, right? Whatever a chaotic thing may happen out there, but I am fine with it, because I am able to understand whether this is what it is actually has to do with me and not. But it will definitely not be the case with many others. So how would you understand these concepts of Papam, Punyam, Swargam, Narakam, the Purushartha model? So how would you actually express these and understand these? And why do you think that these are meaningful?
Just the way you had your journey, Srinivas Garu, of looking at the cultural phenomenon, consuming it, agreeing with it initially, then being resurrected by Shastra, and the Shastra worldview now being your anchor to look at things. It's been a similar journey for me. Obviously, I don't have the benefit or the privilege or the bhagyam of going through a traditional anugraha. But in my own way, in my own journey, I've come to share a similar understanding of these terms. But I also completely agree with you, and I see this day in and day out in a lot of people that I interact with, that the lack of this worldview is what is creating tremendous amount of psychological violence in people. And the emptiness, the loneliness, the xenophobia that we speak about today, in my opinion, is a direct result of the loss of this metaphysics. And I'll quickly explain why I say that. As I come from a typical 90s generation beneficiary of a IT revolution, which has created some jobs, and fairly ordinary talent, finding yourself at the right place in the right time, and just making the most of your opportunities to get ahead in career in some ways. Right? But in doing that, you also have, there's a nice Telugu word for it, wealthy, right? A void. And that void is within you. Right? Because you're given narratives about your own culture, your own civilization as you interact with the world. And that does not necessarily fit into your experience of yourself or what you're seeing around you. So there is this question, this nagging question about what is the place, what is our real story, and who we are, how we've come to be where we are, and what is our purpose from now on. So to understand that, you try and read a little bit, and then you think about this in political terms, that there is a state, there is a nation, there is democracy. If you're able to somehow create equality, liberty, and fraternity, and follow constitution, this will automatically lead to this. When there's a lot of power in that story, we understand the historical context. We understand why the story has explanatory power. But you look at that, and then you look around the world, and you also see that that story has reached a certain kind of shelf life, the end of the shelf life. At least in your own intellectual journey, you start going beyond the political philosophy that is given to you and the institutional structure that's given to you, to go into the fundamentals of life itself. And that is where you come back a full circle to understand what is papam, what is punyam, what is Svarga, what is Naraka, what is Purushartha, what is Moksha. And then you realize, as you also, personally for me, I also like to synthesize from multiple disciplines. This is not science as we understand it in terms of measuring it in a specific way and making it generalizable. This is today, there's a whole new field of neurosciences. This is psychology. Right? What we are talking about is fundamental stability inside the very core of a human being. And that is not a function of any scientific assessment. That cannot be measured also by any scientific tools or scientific apparatus. It is a first-person subjective experience, and well-being is experienced fundamentally. It is not to be explained. Right? And to do that, you need to have a Diksuchi. You need to have a compass in life. And that compass cannot be only, today the compass that the modern culture gives you is pursuit of liberty and happiness. But that liberty, which is essentially an idea of freedom and equality, and there's a tension there. You are trying to architect an equal society, but you're also arguing for freedom. There is an inherent tension there. Right? Let's quickly take a look at the Western civilization, for example. Right? The fundamental value is reason. We are, as human beings, we are above the entire chain because we have the ability to reason. And by employing our reason, we can think about our costs and benefits. And therefore, all the institutional structures, from your markets to your political institutions, are based on this principle. But it is also the same culture that promotes unbridled freedom. Right? And unbridled freedom includes the freedom to excess, whether it is indulgence in drugs, whether it is indulgence in other kinds of vices. If you don't have the yogic framework of understanding your own constitution, your physical, emotional, psychological constitution, and if your only idea is freedom, and if you're employing the freedom, let's say, to have drugs, then how can you employ reason? Do we see the fundamental tension that on one side, you are amplifying things that destroy the faculty of reason. On the other side, you're saying all your institutions have to operate on this faculty of reason. So there is a fundamental tension there, which is irreconcilable. When I look at the Western civilization today, I think it is struggling because it cannot reconcile between these two kinds of, completely disparate and disjointed things. Then you look at it from a Purushartha model. You look at the integrated vision of life. you understand that, an experience of well-being. And Artha, once again, you would know much, much better than all of us. The definition of Artha is holistic. Similarly, the entire civilization, I find, is a meditation on dealing with desire. Desire is not to be burnished. Desire is not to be banished. Desire is not to be avoided. Desire is to be engaged with in a sustainable manner and use that desire to transform, use that desire to actually transcend. And that is where the idea of moksha as the transcendental category becomes critical. If you do not have this, what we're seeing in the Western civilization today is fundamentally two ideas. One is you only live once. It's called YOLO in contemporary terms. It again is a excuse for a consumerist society. You can consume, you can indulge in excess because you only live once. And therefore you have the right to appropriate whatever is there. It is again the biblical idea of man above everything else, representation of the Abrahamic God, who is, who's been given nature for the consumption and for his or her benefit. Right? So this is also the idea that has informed science. We think of science today, you alluded to science, we think of science as something that is completely rational, but science is also a theology by itself. It has definitely become a theology today. If you just look at the vaccine debate, you would understand how much of a hardened religion it is. Right? The other idea is FOMO. Because you only live once, you don't want to miss out. FOMO is fear of missing out. So this is supplied by the culture and advertisement. So there is excess production, which is fundamentally against the principle of our idea of Artha. There is the psychological sort of temptation or a moral excuse given for consumption, which means that you are given the agency to indulge in excess. And in doing that, we know from a yogic perspective that that thing can only pollute your chitta, and that can only actually damage your psychological self in over a long period of time and render you incapable of being joyful or content. Contentment is totally missing from the global civilization today, simply because you haven't created the right kind of economic and psychological structures around it. So if you look at the problems of the world and then you understand the category of papam and punyam, and it's very interesting that the theology that the West has the idea of sin going all the way back to the original sin, but it cannot have the idea of punya. Right? There is no word for punya. Punya, or there's no translation for that. Because there is no concept of transcendence. There is no concept of the possibility of divine for the human being. Right? There is no concept of oneness with the rest of the being, with the rest of the nature. So when I look at these categories, when I look at our own metaphysics, I get a meaning that is completely out of bounds of political philosophy. And it is this metaphysics that has to influence and inform your politics. It is this metaphysics that has to influence your culture. It is this metaphysics that has to influence your social design. It is not the other way around. You first understand what is the truth of your being, and then you create systems that are aligned with the truth, which is what I look at as dharma. Right? Dharma is the ability to create context or the principle, action. It is all of these things together, which allows us to sustain, which allows us to endure, which allows us to address the fundamental need that you spoke about, of the fundamental primal need of passing on what we know to our kids in an undiluted manner, as an undiluted manner as possible. Right? So that is possible because you have a continuity in this knowledge system. When the whole idea is reason, disruption, fear of missing out, you only live once, you are not a civilization in the actual sense of the word, because there is continuous discontinuity. There is no passing on of knowledge and meaning from one generation to another. Every generation is asked to discover its own meaning, only for the next generation to come and disrupt it. This is violence. This is a psychological violence that they are actually subjecting themselves to. Unfortunately, because they have the capital and they have the power and they have the talent and genius with marketing and making products, they are also subjecting us to that violence. So the only way to actually reject that violence is go back to the categories of Purushartha, Punya, and Papa, Swarga, and Naraka. But to understand this not as the hard science, but to understand this as neuroscience, to understand this as behavioral science, to understand this as psychology itself. So psychology, I think, is a good discipline for us if we have to articulate this to the rest of the world.
So then coming to the present, the festival, which is, essentially tomorrow. So the five things that on Naraka Chaturdashi are, one is Tailabhyanga Snanam, then comes what we call it as a Kartika Snanam, then we have Yamatarpanam, then we have Ulka Danam or Ulka Pradarshanam, and the fifth one is Deepa Prajalan. So each and everything has an origin to it, has a significance to it, and I've dealt with that. So after knowing all this from your perspective, how the effect, I mean, what could be the positive effect in one way, and what is the what you call what could it lead to something else, in fighting these dismantling forces, about knowing the origin and significance, and how that can happen?
Yeah. And because I'm now in an area where we research on learning, how we learn, how we retain, I understand the power of the idea of embodied cognition. There is a way that you can learn by just understanding the concept, intellectually analyzing it, and sort of ascribing a truth value to it and application to it. Right? There is another way of learning, which is by exchange of dialogue, right? Which could also be about common meaning making. But a very powerful way of learning, which is, I think, the real genius of our culture, is the performative element, is the actual ability to immerse yourself in the act, and the act transforming you. Okay? So the way I look at the vidhis and paddhatis that are given to us is that it is actually the gift of the rishis to make our lives simpler by just giving us the beautiful ways of engaging and learning truth, engaging with and learning truth. Right? If I were to be analyzing why this sthiti, why this day, why is this oil, why, there will be, in some ways, like you said, a scientific explanation to it. Most of it is tied to natural cycles, all of that. But there'll also be a contextual psychological element to that, right? Which is beyond your scope of analysis. But if I engage in that, if I actually follow those 4 or 5 steps, we do this in all of the secular activities, by the way, right? If you look at an Independence Day celebration, we do all of these things without questioning, right? But it is only because we've created this artificial separation, like we said, in our minds about religion. Yes, Sanatana Dharma is not religion. Religion is something that has been rubbed on our head in an Abrahamic sense. But there is a common understanding of that word today. And that word involves certain rituals and practices which are transformative. You can understand this in art. When you start, take up any, even people who don't subscribe to religion, when they start practicing Bharatanatyam, for example, right, they get transformed, because through the art of performance, they get into a state of Antakarana Shuddhi. It is the same idea of Antakarana Shuddhi, which is coming from, in my understanding, from the ritual of Yajna, which is actually aligning your Manasa, Vacha, Karmana, which is giving you this means, get into the right psychological frame, experience well-being, experience joy, experience contentment. These are fundamental human needs. It does not matter which part of the world you come from. Your psychology and psychological makeup is largely the same. And the tools and rituals that our culture has given you are probably the best means for you to experience well-being. Okay? Apart from the transcendental value, apart from the spiritual value, just for you to experience comfort with yourself, experience oneness with your family, experience a sense of shared culture with the rest of your society. These things are the sort of interfaces that have been given to us. So the way I understand this is you perform to transform yourself. And that element is not just pedagogical, but it is also deeply personal.
So this is what we call it as karma yoga in the Shastric terms, right? Enjoying the process actually, and not thinking about what it will lead to. Because nowadays the whole scenario is like, if you have to do something, the first question will be asked, what is it in me? So I actually personally feel an interesting thing for me would be not watching a movie, but watching the making of the movie and knowing the process of making the movie. Because that is very much beautiful. The thought that erupted, maybe if you see some of the Christopher Nolan movies like Inception and etc., I am fascinated with the moment when that person had this idea of visualizing the idea of dream into multiple levels, and the way that he could have thought about how to put it into multiple things, and how very maybe stitching through many very much the multi-layered thing, and weaving the whole cloth in such a way that it is very simple at the same time very complicated. And this process is actually very much interesting, rather than the movie that which we normally see. It's my personal view over there. I find this thing in each and everywhere. If a building is constructed, what could be the architecture's thought, what could be the builder's thought, what could be the engineer's thought behind that, so with which they could have done this. So what could be the hurdles that they may have undergone through that. So that process is very knowledgeable than just enjoying the architect the whole building out there. So in that way,
is that also how Shastras train you to grab the tattva, to understand the essence, like not get lost in the details, but go to the core. I find remarkably in all the Shastric scholars,
yes,
that they are able to grasp the core of any concept very, very quickly. Is that something that gets trained as part of the
yeah, actually that's why we have this concept called Adhikari Prabheda, Uttamadhikari, Madhyamadhikari and Adhamadhikari. So the Adhamadhikaris cannot understand the core. So they will be only dealing with the peripheral things out there, the outer core only, they will be going there. And the Madhyamadhikaris, they are every time, they want some reward out of it. So Adhamadhikaris will not understand the purpose of it at all. They are like, they'll be forcefully doing things. So that is where this dogmatic, thing happens. Even we do have, people who think, in the what we call it as Moodanamaka. People do that kind of rituals also. The same ritual is done by the Adhamadhikari in the form of Moodanamaka. But the Madhyamadhikari, he'll align himself with the reward very much. So that happens. And the Uttamadhikari, he is not bothered about what will happen out of it. What is the reward that am I going to get about it? But the process which is there, I'll do that, because that is what at the end all the Karma Yoga, Siddhantas or whatever, because without the rituals there cannot be moksha. Normally nowadays it is in the popular culture that leave all the karma and then just only sit and think about Brahman. So that's actually not the Shastric way of knowing it. That's why we have Purva Mimamsa first and then comes Uttara Mimamsa. So this Karma Kanda will eventually lead to the Jnana Kanda and then to moksha. So their rituals are very much needed, and that is where you have to transform yourself from a Madhyamadhikari to Uttamadhikari. So an Uttamadhikari every time only indulges in the process rather than the reward part of it. He will not every time think about what is it for me, and let us just try what it could lead to. So in that way, I think Shastra naturally, maybe not intentionally or consciously, will lead a person there, but naturally the person starts thinking in that way that he becomes a Karma Yogi. So it is moreover like it's a natural. This happened to me. I don't call myself a Uttamadhikari. No, nowhere like that. I'm just a commoner, I say, because even in the traditional this thing, I'm not a whole, I don't do a lot of Anushtana and etc. I'm just a medium, an average person in every field. So, but there are some really great people who do Karma Anushtana in such a way that they never think about the reward that even the Shastra state, because Shastra itself states that reward is meaningless. But many people find this contradicting. You say that Swarga Kamo Ejeta, do this Yajna for Swarga, but then after going to Bhagavad Gita, he says that Yajna Arthat Karmano Nyatra Lokojam Karmavandhanaha, and you say do for Parameshwara Preeti. They find it contradictory. Rather, actually, they are complementary to each other. They help you to transcend from one state to another, the higher state, because that can only happen in Manushya Loka and only in the Manushya Yoni. This transcending thing, as we have the Sapta Urdhva Lokas and Sapta Adho Lokas, all these others, like what is the difference between Naraka, Swarga and Bhuloka is that these both Naraka and Swargalokas are Kevalam Bhoga Bhumis. That means there you cannot attain some Punya or Papa over there. You can only reap the benefits of Punya and Papa over there. So in Narakaloka is a place similar to Bhuloka, where you only experience, predominantly experience Dukkham, the reward of Papam. And Swargam is also the same place similar to Bhuloka, where you predominantly experience Sukham. And they are not unlimited over there. You have a limit. You go there, experience your Dukkham or Sukham, and then again come back to Martyaloka, and then again earn something, and again reap the benefits of it. Okay. So this is the concept of these Saptalokas or Chaturdasha Bhuvanas and etc. whatever they say. These are all places similar to Bhuloka, but Bhuloka is the only loka where you can actually acquire something and actually transcend yourself. There is no scope of becoming Uttamadhikari from Madhyamadhikari. But only this loka has that privilege. So that is why here this happens. So that is why these all Shastras tend to, because that is the only thing that you can take from from here. Now, what is it that we can give our next generation is only knowledge. Yeah. Because it is very scientific. Scientific ka matlab hai yahan pe Shastra. Yeah. Why? Because there we have these three Sharira, concept where Sukshma Sharira, Sthula Sharira and, Karna Sharira. So this Sukshma Sharira or Linga Sharira itself is leaving this lokam and going to somewhere else, leaving this Sthula Sharira. This is what is death all about. What are the elements of Sukshma Sharira? There are 16 elements of Sukshma Sharira. Pancha Pranaha, Pancha Jnanendriyani, Pancha Karmendriyani and Manas. So Pancha Vayus are there. Pancha Vayus, Prana, Apana, Vyana, Udana and Samana. And there are Pancha Jnanendriyas, the 5 sensory organs. And Pancha Karmendriyas, Karma sensory, Vak, Pani, Pada, Pada. And the one other thing is Manas. So you see, these first 15 elements have nothing to do with transcendence. They cannot be changed. Their nature cannot be changed. Eyes can only grab color. So this is, you cannot change the nature of sensory organs, 10 sensory organs, or the nature of the 5 pranas over there. The only thing that can be changed or transcended is only your manas. So what does manas carry? It carries the samskaras. It carries, your experiences. It carries your papam punyam. It carries your jnanam. So at the end, what are you taking from yourself is these samskaras, these papam and punyam, this jnanam and etc., which will be helpful you for the next shariram. So in that sense, what is that you can give your kid or your next generation is only jnana, only the good samskaras. And that is the only permanent thing that will stay with that particular jiva in that particular linga shariram and nothing else. So that is why we every time say these, whatever the possessions that we have, materialistic possessions, they are nothing to do with it. These are all nashwaram. And that is why we should not concentrate upon giving these to our children, but something that lies with them. So what is it that after thinking a lot, I just found that only, yes, only the jnanam, only the knowledge or samskaras that only can be given to our kids or our next generation or to anyone else. So that is why knowledge or samskaras or everything, Shastram is every time thinking about this. How can the knowledge be passed away and what is knowledge all about? How can we acquire knowledge? What are the processes of acquiring knowledge? So that is why this kind of a, explanation is vast explanation is given in our Shastras, concentrating upon all these aspects and elements, and papam and punyam, they are very much, needed in that scenario. So it makes very meaningful for me, but and the effect is very, really, really very good. Right? So in order to bring this out, and at the same time, this is one thing out, and what and how I just wanted to ask one thing, that after knowing the significance and the origin of all these practices and etc., having it a relation with this karma yoga or whatever thing, and what is the effect of knowing this in regard to this dismantling forces kind of thing?
So just thank you for that. It's just every time I hear about this, I wonder, and I have so much of gratitude for the rishis and all the munis who've given us this knowledge tradition. This is exactly what is missing in the mainstream ideas. For example, let's take the central problem of ecology and environment today. I've already mentioned that the dominant impulse today is fear of missing out, and you only live once. Contrast that with what you have given us, that the only thing that you carry with you is the samskara, and that is your true treasure. And once you understand it, your behavior is regulated automatically. The biggest problem that the world has today, ecology, economy, poverty, every single problem has a root cause for that. And that is the inability for people to self-regulate and collaborate for a higher interest, to sacrifice a short-term gratification need for a longer-term interest of the collective. This is a central governance problem of life at an individual level, and also a problem for organizing the society. So, which is why we say that the Indian metaphysics, when I understood these concepts, it is only the Indian metaphysics of Papam, Punyam, Swargam, Punarjarma, Purushartha, which can give you the ability to actually self-regulate with joy. You cannot ask people not to pursue joy, because that is not fundamentally possible at a human level. It is just that the definition of joy has been inextricably associated with consumption and seeking and goal formation today. You need to give a different definition, a different possibility of joy. And that is the idea of evolving internally, to be able to refine your own samskaras, to actually become divine. And that has to be made accessible. So when I think about these ideas, and unless you do that, you're not going to solve the problem of ecology, because you are creating an excess and you are asking people, you're telling people that they only live once. So they will consume, because that is joy. And that has also become your economic system, whether it is energy, whether it is materials, whether it is whatever you get from earth, whether it is going and recapturing oceans, or just the mindless use of plastic. Everything is because I am programmed today to chase instant gratification. That is what the technology is supplying me. That is what the culture is setting as a goal for me. And therefore, there is no idea of delaying gratification or actually being mindful of the samskara that engagement leaves me with. So it is this alternate metaphysics that the Sanatana Dharma provides, which talks about the ability to renounce, and not without joy, the ability to renounce joyously with knowledge, not as a punishment, not as a banishment. That is actually the only way sustainable development can happen, whatever we are framing it as sustainable development. Without this fundamental metaphysics, all of that discourse is just hogwash, and that is what we are seeing. You might be surprised to know, in the last, I think the goals were formed somewhere in 2015. They have a history of evolution themselves. But in the last 5 years of concerted global action by the entire global business, political, social leadership today, we've actually regressed on all of those goals, not progressed. And this is a paradox that they cannot just reconcile, because you do not have a foundational philosophy as an anchor. Our condition of oceans, our condition of ecology, our condition of biosphere is worse today than it was 5 years ago in all objective parameters, after the world has come together to commit so much, because you do not have the means for people to self-regulate and collaborate for longer term gratification, because they do not have the idea of dharma, because they do not have the means and tools of joy and fulfillment, purushartha sadhana, without actually destroying nature. So this is existential nature. This is not about some esoteric reactionary sort of conversation where either we are chasing some abstract goals of giving up, or we are just reacting because we think somebody has targeted us unfairly. This is not about that. This is about a global common future, which cannot happen unless you have a different metaphysics. Which is why when I look at the concepts that you elucidated, I look at them not as just means of personal fulfillment, which they definitely are, but as a means for actually the survival of the planet itself. And in my mind, there is absolutely 100% alignment and clarity that this is the only way that we will survive. And Sanatana Dharma will show the way to the world once again in leading this pursuit of living with nature.
Okay, sir. Oh, it was really wonderful talking to you, sir. Would you like to tell anything else, or
No, it was
shall we
wonderful
wrap up?
talking to you. I look forward to many more conversations, and I thank you once again for taking up contemporary issues, helping us understand the Shastric perspective, helping us understand how beautiful and how meaningful the Shastra Vidhis are, and how they evolve you as a person. But in doing that, they also create a scope for global commons. So thank you so much for that. This is something that we absolutely need on a consistent basis. And I look forward to talking to you on many, many more such topics.
Thank you very much, sir. So we'll end this conversation with Shanti Mantra. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramayaha, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.